They say no good deed goes unpunished, but nobody tells you that a single act of kindness can pull you straight into the darkest, most dangerous underworld in the city. When 24-year-old waitress Adele Hayes saw a shivering, tear-stained 5-year-old boy standing alone in a torrential Boston downpour, she didn't hesitate. She pulled him inside. She warmed him up. She wiped the mud and the blood from his small hands. But she had no idea that the silent child clutching her apron belonged to Arthur Moretti, the most ruthless crime boss on the East Coast. And by saving his only son, Adele didn't just paint a target on her own back. She became the Mafia kingpin's greatest liability and his most dangerous obsession. The rain in Boston that night didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to punish the city. It was a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the neon sign of O'Rourke's 24/7 diner into a blurry, bleeding streak of red against the black pavement. Adele Hayes wiped down the Formica counter for the 4th time in an hour, her reflection staring back at her in the scratched surface. At 24, she was exhausted. Working the graveyard shift meant dealing with the dregs of the city, drunks trying to sober up on black coffee, insomniacs staring into the void, and the occasional trucker passing through. Tonight, however, the diner was a ghost town. The storm had kept everyone away. "I'm going to the back to check the inventory." Sarah, the shift manager, called out, her voice barely cutting through the sound of thunder rattling the large glass windows. "Lock the till, Adele. I don't like the feel of tonight." "Got it," Adele replied, tossing her damp rag into the sink. She poured herself a cup of decaf and walked over to the front windows, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her waist. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the flooded street. That was when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe a stray dog huddled near the newspaper dispensers. But as a flash of lightning illuminated the sidewalk, Adele's breath caught in her throat. It was a child. He couldn't have been older than 5. He was standing completely still, soaked to the bone, wearing a saturated navy blue peacoat that looked far too expensive for this neighborhood. He was clutching a small wooden toy car to his chest, his head bowed against the biting wind. Adele didn't think. She didn't grab an umbrella or her coat. She shoved the heavy glass door open and ran out into the deluge. The cold hit her like a physical blow, instantly soaking through her thin waitress uniform. "Hey!" she yelled over the roar of the rain, dropping to her knees on the flooded sidewalk. "Hey, sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" The boy didn't flinch. He just slowly lifted his head. His eyes were wide, dark, and completely vacant, locked in a state of profound shock. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. When Adele reached out to touch his shoulder, he flinched violently, shrinking away from her. "It's okay," Adele said softly, keeping her voice as steady as she could despite her violently shivering jaw. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let's get inside, okay? It's warm." She gently took his small, icy hand. He offered no resistance, letting her guide him out of the storm and into the brightly lit diner. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, a stark contrast to the grim reality standing on the welcome mat. Adele quickly grabbed a stack of clean towels from the back counter. She knelt in front of the boy, draping a large towel over his trembling shoulders. "Where are your parents, honey? What's your name?" Silence. The boy just stared at her name tag. As Adele gently dabbed the water from his face, her hand brushed against his cheek. She noticed a dark, smudged streak near his hairline. She wiped it away with the towel, pulling the fabric back to look at it under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her stomach plummeted. It wasn't mud. It was rust-colored and stark against the white cotton. It was blood. Adele's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She looked closer at his expensive coat, noticing for the first time that the right sleeve was torn, and there were dark splatters across his collar. The boy wasn't bleeding. She checked him frantically, which meant the blood belonged to someone else. "Sarah!" Adele yelled, panic finally edging into her voice. "Sarah, get out here." Before Sarah could emerge from the stockroom, the boy suddenly grabbed Adele's wrist. His grip was shockingly strong for a child. He looked frantically toward the front door, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. Through the rain-streaked windows, Adele saw a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A heavy, dark SUV slowed to a crawl right outside the diner. Instinct is a funny thing. Adele had never been in a dangerous situation in her life, but looking at the absolute terror in the little boy's eyes, a primal, protective urge overrode her panic. The heavy doors of the SUV opened. Two men stepped out into the rain. They weren't cops. Cops, in this part of town, looked overworked and sloppy. These men wore tailored black suits that seemed immune to the weather, their faces hard and unreadable. Under the counter, Adele whispered urgently to the boy, "Go behind the pie display. Do not make a sound. Understand?" The boy nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and scrambled behind the counter, curling himself into a tiny ball in the dark recess beneath the cash register. Adele stood up just as the diner bell chimed. The two men stepped inside, bringing the chill of the storm with them. The taller one, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, scanned the empty booths with dead, pale eyes. The second man, built like a freight train, locked the front door behind them and flipped the open sign to closed. Adele's mouth went dry. "Excuse me," she managed to say, forcing her hands to stop shaking by gripping the edge of the counter. "You can't lock that. We're open 24/7." The scarred man walked slowly toward the counter. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at the puddles of water on the floor, the water Adele and the boy had tracked in just moments ago. "Terrible night for a walk," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "We're looking for someone. A little boy, about this high." He held his hand waist level, dark hair, blue coat. He wandered away from his babysitter. "I haven't seen a child," Adele lied smoothly, praying the tremor in her knees didn't show. "It's 3 in the morning in a hurricane. No kids around here, just me and the cook in the back." The large man stepped forward, his eyes landing on the damp, blood-stained towel sitting on the counter. Adele had forgotten to hide it. "You cut yourself, sweetheart?" the big man asked, pointing a massive, calloused finger at the towel. Adele's mind raced. "Yeah," she lied without missing a beat, holding up her left hand where a faded burn mark from a hot plate sat on her wrist, slipped with the bread knife earlier. Bloody mess. The scarred man leaned over the counter, invading her space. He smelled of rain, cheap cologne, and something metallic, gunpowder. Adele's breath hitched. "Listen to me, waitress," the scarred man said softly. "The boy saw something he shouldn't have. He belongs to a very bad man, and we need to collect him before his father realizes he's missing. If you're hiding him, you are signing your own death warrant. I'll ask you one more time. Have you seen a little boy?" Adele looked the man dead in the eyes. She thought of the child trembling beneath her feet. If these men were looking for him, his father, being a bad man, was irrelevant. They were going to hurt the boy. "I told you," Adele said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "There are no kids here. If you want a coffee, sit down. If not, get out before I press the silent alarm under this register." The two men exchanged a look. The tension in the air was so thick it was suffocating. Finally, the scarred man tapped his knuckles on the counter. "Let's go, Silas," the scarred man said. The brat probably ducked into the alleyways. They backed away, unlocked the door, and stepped back out into the storm. Adele didn't move a muscle until the SUV's taillights vanished down the street. Only then did her knees give out. She slid down the side of the counter, collapsing onto the floor right next to the boy. He was staring at her, tears finally spilling over his dark eyelashes. Adele pulled him into her arms, burying her face in his damp hair. "It's okay," she choked out. "They're gone." But she knew they were running out of time. If those men were hunting him, someone else would be too. For the next 2 hours, Adele kept the boy hidden in the manager's office in the back. Sarah had come out, taken one look at Adele's pale face and the trembling child, and asked 0 questions. Sarah simply brought a blanket, a plate of fries, and stood guard near the front door with a heavy cast-iron skillet. Adele learned 2 things about the boy during that time. First, he was deeply traumatized, refusing to speak a single word. Second, written on the inside tag of his coat in elegant, faded ink, was the name Leo. "Leo," Adele whispered, sitting on the floor beside him in the dim office. "Do you remember your phone number? Can I call your mum?" Leo shook his head, looking down at his hands. Around 5 a.m., the rain finally began to ease into a steady drizzle. Adele was debating whether to call the police. Detective Miller, a regular, usually started his shift around 6 a.m. when Sarah burst into the back office, her face paper white. "Adele," Sarah gasped, clutching her chest. "You need to come out here. Now." "Are they back?" Adele asked, her blood running cold as she stood up, positioning herself between Leo and the door. "No," Sarah said. her voice shaking violently. "It's someone else." Adele told Leo to stay under the desk and walked out into the main dining area. The diner, usually filled with the smell of grease and coffee, felt strangely sterile. The air was charged, electric. Outside, a sleek, armored black Lincoln Continental was parked directly across the front doors. 4 men in immaculate suits were found out on the sidewalk, their eyes scanning the street, hands resting casually near their jackets. But it was the man standing inside her diner that made Adele's heart stop. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out a tailored charcoal suit perfectly. His dark hair was slightly damp, pushed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from marble, strikingly handsome, but completely devoid of warmth. His eyes were a piercing, icy grey, scanning the room with the calculated precision of a predator. He didn't look like a hitman. He looked like royalty. Lethal, untouchable royalty. "Where is he?" the man asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a frequency of absolute authority that commanded the room. Adele swallowed hard, stepping forward. "We're closed." The man turned his icy gaze to her. The eye contact was physical, pinning her to the spot. He took slow, measured steps toward her until he was separated from her only by the counter. "My name is Arthur Moretti," he said, his voice deadly calm. "3 hours ago, an ambush hit my convoy. My driver was killed. My son ran into the storm. My men tracked a rival cruise vehicle to this street, and I see mud on your floor." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "I will not ask twice. Where is my son?" Adele's mind short-circuited. Moretti. Everyone in Boston knew the name Moretti. They owned the ports, the politicians, and half the police force. Arthur Moretti was a ghost, a myth of violence and power that ran the city from the shadows. And Adele had his son. She opened her mouth to speak, to lie, to do something, but a small sound interrupted her. From the hallway leading to the back office came the soft patter of feet. Adele turned. Leo was standing in the doorway, the large blanket trailing behind him. He looked at Adele, then looked past her, to the towering figure in the charcoal suit. For the first time all night, the boy made a sound, a ragged, heartbreaking sob. "Papa." The entire demeanor of the terrifying Mafia boss shattered in an instant. The ice in Arthur Moretti's eyes melted into desperate relief. He bypassed the counter entirely, dropping to his knees on the greasy diner floor without a second thought, catching the boy as Leo launched himself into his arms. Adele stood frozen, watching the most dangerous man in the city bury his face in his son's neck, visibly shaking as he held the boy tight. Arthur closed his eyes, whispering in rapid, frantic Italian into Leo's hair. After a long moment, he pulled back, checking the boy for injuries, his large hands gently cupping Leo's face. "Did they hurt you, piccolo mio?" Arthur asked, his voice thick with emotion. Leo shook his head, then turned and pointed a small finger directly at Adele. "She hid me. The bad men came, and she hid me." Arthur slowly stood up, picking Leo up and resting him on his hip. He turned his gaze back to Adele. The vulnerability was gone, replaced once again by the cold, calculating stare of a kingpin. But this time, he wasn't looking at her like an obstacle. He was looking at her like an anomaly. "2 men came here looking for him?" Arthur asked, his tone shifting into something dangerously quiet. "Yes," Adele rasped, her hands still shaking. "About 2 hours ago. I lied to them. I sent them away." Arthur looked at the faded burn on her wrist, then at the blood-stained towel still sitting by the register. He processed the entire scene in a matter of seconds. An ordinary waitress, unarmed and alone, had looked 2 armed cartel assassins in the eye and lied to save a child she didn't even know. Arthur Moretti walked toward her, stopping just inches away. Adele had to tilt her head back to look at him. He pulled a sleek black card from his inner pocket and placed it on the counter. It had a single phone number printed on it, nothing else. "You saved my blood tonight, Adele," Arthur said, reading her name tag. "In my world, a debt of blood is absolute. I don't know who you are, but you are now under my protection." "I don't want your protection," Adele whispered, terrified of the door she had just opened. "I just wanted to help the boy. Take him and go, please." A dark, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of Arthur's mouth. "The men who came here tonight won't stop until they tie up loose ends," Arthur said softly, his eyes dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze again. "They saw your face which means, starting tomorrow, you are a target. He adjusted Leo in his arms and turned toward the door, where his men were waiting in the rain. He paused, looking over his shoulder at her. "Pack your bags, Adele Hayes. My men will be back for you at dawn. You belong to the Moretti family now." The sun didn't rise over Boston that morning. It just bled a pale, sickly grey through the smog. Adele sat on the edge of her lumpy twin bed, her entire life crammed into a single faded canvas duffel bag. She had spent the last 3 hours pacing her cramped studio apartment, debating whether to take the fire escape and run. But run where? Her bank account had double digits, and her only family was an estranged aunt in Ohio who wouldn't know what to do with a Mafia hit squad. At exactly 6 a.m., a heavy knock echoed through the thin walls of her apartment. Adele jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed her bag, her knuckles white, and opened the door. Standing in the poorly lit hallway was a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a GQ magazine, were it not for the slight bulge of a shoulder holster under his tailored navy suit. "Miss Hayes," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "My name is Matteo. Mr. Moretti sent me. The car is waiting downstairs." Adele looked past him, half expecting the scarred man from the diner to step out of the shadows. "Do I really have a choice, Matteo?" Matteo's expression softened slightly, a flicker of genuine pity in his dark eyes. "In my experience, Miss Hayes, when Arthur Moretti opens a door for you, it is much safer to walk through it than to try and close it. The men who visited your diner belong to the Volkov syndicate. They are not known for leaving loose ends." Swallowing her fear, Adele followed him down to the street. A black armored SUV, identical to the ones from the diner, idled at the curb. The drive took less than an hour, pulling them out of the gritty urban sprawl and into the heavily wooded, affluent suburbs outside the city. They turned down a private, winding road flanked by stone walls and iron gates that swung open silently at their approach. The Moretti estate wasn't just a house, it was a fortress, masked as a sprawling, modern architectural masterpiece of glass, dark wood, and steel. Adele was escorted into a grand foyer that smelled of lemon oil and expensive leather. Before she could even process the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding her, a set of heavy mahogany doors opened, and Arthur stepped out. In the harsh light of day, he was even more intimidating. He wore a crisp, white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing a map of intricate, dark tattoos winding up his forearms. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his ice-gray eyes prominent, but his posture was rigid with authority. "Matteo, check the perimeter," Arthur ordered without looking at his right-hand man. He locked eyes with Adele. "Follow me." He led her into a massive study lined with books and surveillance monitors. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, offering her one. Adele shook her head. "I don't drink," she said, her voice tight, "and I don't want to be here. I'm grateful you want to keep me safe, Mr. Moretti, but I'm just a waitress. The Volkovs, or whoever they are, don't care about me." Arthur took a slow sip of his drink, leaning against the edge of his heavy oak desk. "Grigory Volkov cares about anything that embarrasses him. His men failed to secure my son, and a civilian thwarted them. By noon today, they will have your name, your address, and your work schedule. You are not a bystander anymore, Adele. You are a witness who humiliated cartel assassins." He set his glass down, the clink echoing in the quiet room. "You saved Leo. In my family, that means I owe you my life. You will stay here. You will be guarded. When the Volkovs are dealt with, you can return to your life with enough money to buy that diner 10 times over. But until then, you are not leaving these grounds. Is that understood?" It wasn't a request. It was a command issued by a king in his castle. Adele looked into his cold eyes and realized with a sinking dread that she had traded the crosshairs of a cartel for a gilded cage. "Where is Leo?" she asked quietly, changing the subject before her panic could fully set in. A shadow crossed Arthur's face, the ruthless Mafia boss momentarily giving way to a terrified father. "He hasn't spoken a word since I brought him home. He won't let the nanny near him. He won't eat." Arthur looked at Adele, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. "He asked for you." For the next 4 days, Adele existed in a bizarre state of limbo. The estate was vast and beautiful, but the presence of armed guards at every exit was a constant reminder of her captivity. Her only solace was Leo. The little boy clung to her like a lifeline. Adele spent hours sitting with him in his playroom, building elaborate towers out of wooden blocks and reading him stories. He still didn't speak, but the haunted look in his eyes began to fade when she was around. Arthur watched them constantly. Sometimes Adele would look up from a puzzle to find him leaning against the doorframe, his gaze heavy and unreadable. The tension between them was a physical thing, a crackling electricity born of two completely different worlds colliding. He was violence and control. She was warmth and defiance. Late one evening, after finally getting Leo to sleep following a particularly bad night terror, Adele walked down to the massive kitchen to get a glass of water. The house was dead quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. She found Arthur sitting in the dark at the kitchen island, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring blankly at the marble countertop. "He's asleep," Adele said softly, pulling a glass from the cupboard. Arthur didn't look up. He woke up screaming again. "I could hear him from my office." "Trauma doesn't vanish overnight, Arthur," Adele said, taking a seat on the stool across from him. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "His mother was killed in a crossfire 3 years ago," Arthur said, the words heavy and hollow. "A rival family trying to send a message. I promised myself I would burn the world down before I let anything happen to him. And yet, I let him slip through my fingers. If it wasn't for you." "You can't protect him from everything," Adele said gently, leaning forward. "But you can be there when the storm passes." Arthur stared at her, the mask of the ruthless boss completely stripped away. He reached across the island, his large, calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly gentle, sending a jolt of heat straight down Adele's spine. "You are entirely too brave for your own good, Adele Hayes," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. Before Adele could process the intense shift in the atmosphere, a sharp, metallic click echoed from the terrace doors just outside the kitchen. Arthur's hand vanished from her face. In a fraction of a second, the vulnerable father was gone, replaced by a predator. He drew a suppressed handgun from his waistband with terrifying speed, pressing a finger to his lips, signaling Adele to be perfectly silent. He moved like a ghost, slipping into the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Adele's heart hammered in her throat as she crouched behind the heavy kitchen island. Through the sheer curtains, Adele saw a silhouette. It wasn't an intruder from the outside. It was Dominic, one of Arthur's trusted perimeter guards. But Dominic wasn't patrolling. He was standing near the edge of the terrace, a burner phone pressed to his ear, his voice a hushed, urgent whisper. Arthur didn't move, listening intently. "The security rotation shifts at 0300. Dominic's muffled voice carried through the slightly ajar glass door. "The south gate will be blind for exactly 4 minutes. I've disabled the secondary alarms. Tell Grigori to send the heavy hitters. He's in the house, and the girl is with him." Adele's blood ran cold. The threat wasn't just out there in the city. It was inside the gates. Grigori Volkov wasn't planning a hit. He was planning a massacre tonight. Dominic ended the call and turned back toward the house. Before he could even step through the terrace doors, Arthur stepped out of the shadows. Adele squeezed her eyes shut, clapping her hands over her ears just as a heavy, muffled thwip broke the silence of the night. A heavy thud followed. When Adele opened her eyes, Arthur was standing over Dominic's body, his face an impenetrable mask of pure, lethal rage. He pulled his radio from his belt. "Matteo," Arthur said into the comms, his voice terrifyingly calm. "We have a rat. Initiate lockdown protocol Omega. Wake the men. The Volkovs are coming in 3 hours, and we are going to bury them." Arthur turned back to Adele, his eyes blazing with a dangerous fire. "Get Leo," he ordered. "And don't leave my sight." The sprawling Moretti estate, once a silent monument to wealth and power, transformed into a fortress of war in less than 60 seconds. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing them in absolute darkness before the dim, crimson glow of the emergency tactical lights flickered to life. Adele didn't wait for Arthur to repeat his order. She sprinted up the grand mahogany staircase, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She burst into Leo's room. The little boy was already sitting up, his dark eyes wide with the instinctual terror of a child who had lived through violence before. "Leo, come here," Adele whispered urgently, keeping her voice steady despite the sheer panic coursing through her veins. She scooped him into her arms, pressing his head against her shoulder. "We're going to play a hiding game, okay? A quiet game. She hurried back into the hallway just as Matteo appeared at the top of the stairs, flanked by 3 men armed with matte black assault rifles. Matteo's usually perfectly coiffed hair was slightly disheveled, but his eyes were entirely devoid of panic. He was a man built for war. "Miss Hayes, the panic room is behind the library," Matteo instructed, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Code is 4927. Lock it from the inside, and do not open it for anyone except Arthur or myself. Go. Now." Before Adele could take another step, a deafening explosion rattled the very foundations of the house. The sound was so concussive it knocked a crystal chandelier from the ceiling, shattering it into a million glittering daggers across the foyer below. Dust rained down from the plaster. The Volkovs hadn't waited for the 3-hour mark. Dominic's phone call had been a decoy. They were already here. "South wing breach," one of Matteo's men yelled over his radio, raising his rifle as the sound of splintering wood and heavy boots echoed from the first floor. "Move, Adele," Matteo roared, shoving her toward the library wing as he and his men laid down a deafening barrage of suppressing fire down the grand staircase. Adele ran. She clutched Leo so tightly her arms ached, navigating the maze-like corridors of the estate entirely by the red emergency lights. The sound of gunfire, a chaotic symphony of sharp cracks and heavy, rhythmic thuds, echoed through the house, punctuated by shouting in Russian and Italian. She burst into the library, slamming the heavy oak doors shut behind her. She found the false bookshelf Arthur had pointed out to her days ago. 4927. The keypad beeped green, and the heavy steel door hissed open. She darted inside, hitting the internal lock. The panic room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was a concrete bunker equipped with monitors, medical supplies, and weapons. Adele set Leo down on a cot in the corner, wrapping a heavy thermal blanket around him. He was trembling violently, his hands covering his ears. "Look at me, Leo," Adele said, kneeling in front of him and gently pulling his hands away. "You are safe. Your papa is going to protect us. I promise." On the wall, a bank of security monitors flickered, displaying the brutal reality of Arthur Moretti's world. Adele watched in horrified fascination. The estate grounds were crawling with Volkov men, moving like heavily armed shadows. But Arthur's men were dug in, holding the line with terrifying efficiency. Then, her eyes darted to the camera feed for the hallway just outside the library. Arthur was there. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace. His crisp white shirt now stained with blood, whether his own or someone else's. Adele couldn't tell. He dropped 2 Volkov soldiers with precise, calculated shots before ducking behind a marble pillar as the heavy library doors were blown off their hinges. Through the dust and smoke, a massive figure stepped into the hallway. Grigory Volkov. He was an older man, heavily built, with a thick silver beard and a long, dark trench coat. He didn't carry a rifle. He held a heavy silver revolver, looking completely unbothered by the chaos around him. Adele cranked up the audio feed on the monitor, her breath catching in her throat. "Arthur!" Grigory's voice boomed, thick with a heavy Russian accent, echoing through the destroyed hallway. "You can hide behind your marble and your men, but you cannot hide from blood. Give me the boy." "He is my son, Grigory," Arthur's voice fired back, sharp and lethal from behind the pillar. "He is my grandson," Grigory roared, firing a massive shot that shattered the marble near Arthur's head. "He is Isabella's blood. You took my daughter from me, Moretti. Your wars, your enemies, they put her in the ground. I will not let you corrupt her son. I am taking him to Moscow tonight, and I will leave you breathing just long enough to watch my plane depart." Adele gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Isabella. Leo's mother wasn't just a casualty of a rival family. She was the daughter of the Russian syndicate boss. This wasn't just a turf war. It was a grandfather coming for the last piece of his dead daughter. It was a blood feud. On the monitor, Grigory motioned to 2 of his elite guards. They moved aggressively toward Arthur's position, laying down heavy fire that pinned the Mafia boss down. Arthur was running out of ammunition, his movements becoming desperate. He managed to take down 1 guard, but the second one flanked him, kicking the gun from Arthur's hand and driving a knee into his ribs. Arthur hit the floor hard, and Grigory stepped forward, leveling the massive silver revolver right at Arthur's head. "Isabella deserved a king," Grigory spat, "not a corpse. Goodbye, Arthur." Adele didn't think. The primal, reckless instinct that had pushed her out into the rain that first night took over entirely. She wasn't a Mafia soldier. She was a waitress from Southie. But she loved the little boy sitting behind her, and in the last few days, a terrifying, magnetic pull had drawn her to the ruthless man currently staring down the barrel of a gun. Adele grabbed a heavy, loaded Glock 19 from the panic room's weapon rack. She didn't know how to shoot, but she knew how to cause a distraction. She hit the door release. The heavy steel door hissed open, grinding loudly against the floor. Grigori and his guard whipped their heads toward the sound, their focus snapping away from Arthur for exactly 1 second. "Hey!" Adele screamed, stepping out of the bunker, her hands shaking violently as she pointed the heavy weapon down the hallway. Grigori's eyes widened in confusion at the sight of the barefoot woman in a sleep shirt wielding a gun. That split second of confusion was all Arthur needed. Like a coiled viper, Arthur swept the guard's legs out from under him, snatching the guard's dropped weapon in midair. In one fluid, seamless motion, he rolled and fired twice. Grigori Volkov staggered backward, his silver revolver clattering to the hardwood floor. He looked down at the 2 dark blossoms spreading across his chest, then up at Arthur, a look of profound shock freezing on his face before he collapsed to the ground, dead. Silence descended on the hallway, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant wail of police sirens approaching the estate. The remaining Volkov men, hearing over the comms that their boss was down, were already retreating. Arthur slowly pushed himself off the floor, his chest heaving, his face covered in dust and blood. He looked at the dead Russian boss, then turned his gaze slowly to Adele. She was still standing in the doorway of the panic room, the gun trembling in her hands, her eyes wide with shock. Arthur walked toward her, stepping over the debris. He gently reached out, wrapping his large, warm hands over hers, carefully taking the weapon away. He tossed it aside and pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "You foolish, beautiful, reckless woman," he breathed, his voice thick with a vulnerability he had never shown to a living soul. "You saved me." Again. Adele closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around his waist, the smell of gunpowder and his expensive cologne overwhelming her senses. From the shadows of the panic room, a small voice broke the silence. "Papa?" Arthur pulled back, his eyes snapping to the doorway. Leo was standing there, clutching his blanket. It was the first time he had spoken since the diner. Arthur dropped to his knees, pulling Leo into his chest, and then, without looking away from his son, he reached out and grabbed Adele's hand, pulling her down to the floor with them. The morning sun finally broke through the suffocating grey clouds over Boston, casting long, fractured rays of golden light across the ruined foyer of the Moretti estate. The physical devastation of the night before was staggering. The grand mahogany staircase was splintered and chewed to pieces by high-caliber rounds. A priceless 19th-century Venetian chandelier lay in a million glittering shards across the imported marble floor, sparkling innocently in the dawn light. The estate was a hive of quiet, grim activity. The police had already come and gone within a 20-minute window. Matteo had handled it with chilling efficiency, handing over a thick manila envelope to a Captain Donovan, a private name Arthur kept strictly on his payroll under the guise of an unfortunate, massive gas leak explosion in the South Wing. Now, a specialized private cleanup crew, men wearing unmarked grey coveralls and carrying heavy-duty industrial solvents, were meticulously scrubbing the blood from the marble and repairing the shattered threshold. The metallic tang of copper and cordite was slowly being masked by the harsh, stinging scent of industrial bleach. Adele stood at the top of the stairs, still wearing the oversized sleep shirt she had thrown on hours ago, though it was now streaked with plaster dust and ash. She watched the organized chaos below with a numb detachment. Just 4 days ago, her biggest concern had been covering rent and making sure the coffee urns at the diner didn't burn. Now, she had watched men die. She had fired a weapon to distract a Russian mob boss. She had crossed a line that could never, ever be uncrossed. "Miss Hayes," a voice rumbled softly behind her. Adele turned to see Matteo. His tailored suit was ruined, his left arm bound tightly in a stark white bandage, but his posture remained rigid and respectful. "Arthur is waiting for you in his study," Matteo said, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. "Leo is still asleep in the secure room. I have 2 of my best men stationed at his door. He is safe." "Thank you, Matteo," Adele whispered, her voice hoarse from the dust and the screaming. She walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward the west wing. The heavy oak doors to Arthur's private study were slightly ajar. Adele pushed them open and stepped inside. The room was untouched by the violence that had ravaged the rest of the house. It smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the sharp, distinctive scent of a freshly lit cigarette. Arthur was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the manicured, dew-covered lawns. He had changed into a crisp, clean white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the intricate, dark tattoos winding up his forearms. He looked exhausted. The shadows beneath his icy grey eyes were bruised and deep, and the tense set of his broad shoulders carried the weight of a man who had just narrowly avoided losing everything. On the center of his massive, polished oak desk sat a sleek, silver Zero Halliburton briefcase. Arthur took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling a thin plume of blue smoke against the glass before turning to face her. The silence between them was incredibly heavy, charged with the adrenaline of surviving the night and the terrifying, magnetic pull that had been growing between them since the moment he walked into her diner. "Grigory Volkov is dead," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down Adele's spine. "His body is currently in the incinerator of a private waste management facility I own in Chelsea. By noon, his lieutenants in Moscow will receive word that he suffered a fatal heart attack while traveling. Without him, the Volkov syndicate will immediately fracture into a half-dozen warring factions. They will be entirely too busy tearing each other's throats out for control to ever look our way again." Adele swallowed hard, stepping further into the room. "And Leo?" "Leo is free of the shadow his grandfather cast over him," Arthur replied, his expression softening momentarily at the mention of his son. "He will never be hunted by his mother's bloodline again." Arthur walked slowly over to the desk, stopping behind the silver briefcase. He unlatched it. The sharp click-clack of the locks echoed loudly in the quiet study. He flipped the lid open and turned it toward Adele. Adele's breath hitched. The case was packed to the brim, with neatly banded stacks of $100 bills. Nestled in a leather compartment at the top were 2 dark blue passports and a thick stack of legal documents bearing official-looking wax seals. "There is exactly $5 million in untraceable cash in that case," Arthur said, his tone shifting back to the cold, calculating kingpin. He pointed to the documents. Those passports were crafted by Silas Finch, the best ghost maker on the eastern seaboard. They will pass any biometric scan in the world. Next to them is the deed to a secluded, fully staffed, and fully secured villa in the hills of Tuscany, legally purchased under your new name. Adele stared at the money. It was an unfathomable amount of wealth. It was more money than she could make in 100 lifetimes, pouring coffee at O'Rourke's 24/7 diner. It was the ultimate golden parachute. It meant complete freedom. It meant safety. It meant she would never have to worry about the rent, or the cold, or the terrifying violence of cartel wars ever again. "I don't understand," Adele said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up from the briefcase to meet his eyes. "It is exactly what it looks like." "Adele," Arthur said, his jaw tightening. He gripped the edges of the desk, his knuckles turning white. "I am releasing you. The debt of blood is paid in full. You saved my son in the storm. Last night, you saved me from a bullet. You have given me everything, and I am giving you your life back. A better life." Adele felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. It wasn't relief. It was a profound, suffocating sense of loss. "You're sending me away," she whispered, the reality of his words sinking in. Arthur's icy facade cracked. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a look of pure, agonizing torment flashing across his hardened features. When he opened them again, the raw vulnerability in his gaze pinned Adele to the floor. "Look around you." "Adele?" Arthur demanded, his voice rising, echoing off the mahogany walls. "Look at the blood on my floors. Look at the men carrying out the dead. This is my reality. This is the air I breathe. I am a monster who rules over other monsters. I brought Isabella into this life, and it put her in the ground. I will be damned if I let the same thing happen to you." He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them until he was towering over her. He smelled of smoke, expensive cologne, and a desperate, underlying fear. "You are light, Adele," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek, as if he were terrified that touching her would corrupt her. "You are too bright, too good, and too reckless for this dark world. If you stay, my enemies will eventually realize you are my weakness. They will come for you, and I will not survive losing you." Adele looked up into the eyes of the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast. She saw the ruthless killer who had just slaughtered a rival syndicate head without a second thought. But she also saw the desperate, terrified father who had fallen to his knees on a greasy diner floor. She saw the man who had stayed awake for 3 days straight just to make sure she was safe in his home. She looked back at the silver briefcase. It represented an easy out, a safe, quiet, lonely life in a beautiful country where no one knew her name. Adele turned her back to the money. She took a deliberate step forward, entirely closing the gap between them. She reached up, wrapping her small hands around Arthur's wrists, and pulled his hovering hands down, pressing his palms flat against her cheeks. He shuddered at the contact, a ragged breath escaping his lips. "Do you really think I want safety, Arthur?" Adele asked, her voice steady and fierce, completely devoid of the fear she had felt 4 days ago. "Do you think I want to go back to a life where I am invisible, pouring coffee for ghosts in the middle of the night, pretending I am alive?" She held his gaze, her heart hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm against her ribs. "I didn't run into the storm that night because I was brave," Adele continued, her thumbs gently tracing the dark ink on his forearms. "I ran out there because I couldn't stand the thought of a child being alone in the dark, and I didn't step out of that panic room last night because I was a hero. I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of losing you." Arthur stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer force of her words. The cold, impenetrable walls he had built around his heart for years were crumbling into dust. "I am not Isabella," Adele stated fiercely, leaving absolutely no room for argument. "I am not a fragile porcelain doll. You need to hide away in a tower. I survived the streets of Boston. I survived Grigory Volkov, and I can survive you." She let go of his wrists and walked past him toward the heavy oak desk. She placed both of her hands flat on the smooth, polished lid of the silver Halliburton briefcase. With one swift, aggressive motion, she shoved it. The heavy metal case slid across the wood, tipped over the edge, and crashed onto the Persian rug with a loud, final thud. The latches popped open, spilling thick stacks of $100 bills across the floor, discarded and forgotten. Adele turned back to Arthur, her chin tilted up in an act of absolute, beautiful defiance. "I am not taking your money, Arthur Moretti," Adele said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the quiet room. "I don't speak Italian. I don't know the first thing about running shipping lanes or laundering money or dealing with hitmen, but I do know that your son finally spoke last night, and he asked for us. I know that you need someone in this massive, empty fortress to remind you that you are human, and I know exactly where I belong." Arthur stared at the money scattered on the floor, and then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. The fear was gone, completely eradicated by a dark, consuming fire that took Adele's breath away. He was no longer trying to push her away. He was finally, fully accepting the reality of what she was offering. "You are stepping willingly into the abyss, Adele Hayes," Arthur warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory purr as he stalked slowly toward her. "If you make this choice, if you stay, I will bind you to me in ways you cannot even begin to comprehend. The diner, your old life, your freedom, it all burns to the ground today. You will be mine, and I will never, ever let you go." "Then let it burn," Adele whispered, her heart soaring. Arthur didn't hesitate for another second. He closed the remaining distance, his large hands tangling in her hair, and crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a fierce, desperate, claiming. It tasted of adrenaline, survival, and a terrifying, unyielding loyalty. Adele wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the storm. She felt the heavy, muscular tension in his back, the power of a man who could command armies, completely surrendering to the woman in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. A small, genuine smile, the first one Adele had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. "We need to get you proper clothes," Arthur murmured, his thumb brushing a streak of plaster dust from her cheek. "The capos of the 5 families are arriving at noon to discuss the fallout of the Volkov situation. They need to meet the new queen of this family." Adele took a deep breath, looking past his shoulder at the sun rising over the estate, casting a warm, golden light over the ruins of the night. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the matriarch of the most dangerous family in the city, and heaven help the cartel, the syndicate, or the army that ever tried to take her family from her again. What a wild, adrenaline-fueled ride. From a freezing, rain-soaked diner to the bullet-riddled halls of a Mafia fortress, Adele's journey proves that sometimes the most ordinary people possess the most extraordinary courage. She didn't just save a lost boy. She tamed the most feared kingpin in the city and claimed her throne in a dangerous new world. The twist with Grigory Volkov being Leo's grandfather adds that perfect layer of real-life family drama and tragic betrayal that makes Mafia romances so incredibly gripping. Every choice has a consequence, and Adele chose loyalty over a safe escape. If you loved this intense story of danger, devotion, and a fiercely protective romance, let us know. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends who love a good Mafia thriller, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next epic storytelling adventure. See you in the next one.